Alright guys, this should be a very brief and quick Lab 9 review. This is going to be your cerebral fiber pathways and the fiber dissections. Again, brief mission statement for Scrubs. Scrubs is a student-driven initiative that is aiming to develop supplemental resources for current and future cohorts that will pass through Birdie. And we participate in a variety of subcommittees that work to create resources for students, by students, offering a perspective of a student who has gone through these courses before. The hope is that this organization will become a staple of the brilliant student body, exemplifying the unique collaborative community that Birdie offers. This is a mission that aligns with your goals, and you have a desire to help and give back. We are always looking for people to join the team. And again, disclaimer, this is a supplemental resource that is aiming to help supplement your learning, but it is not a replacement for the instruction in lab as well as in your course back. So be sure to use those as primary resources and use this as a supplement to help gain a little bit more of a rounded knowledge, but do rely on your primary materials for the course when it comes to studying for your course exams. Okay, before we get started, I do want to go over some quick definitions as well as some color coding that I'll be using for the rest of this video. There are 3 different types of fibers that you are going to need to know: association fibers, visual fibers, and projection fibers. Association fibers are connecting the cortex to other regions of the cortex, specifically regions of the cortex on the same side. Mostly, these are going to originate from layer 3 of the cortex, which is one of the pyramidal layers. And these are further broken down into short and long association tracts. Short association tracts are going to stay within the same lobe, so the frontal lobe communicating with another region of the frontal lobe. Long association tracts communicate between different lobes, so the frontal lobe communicating with the parietal lobe, for instance. Commissural fibers are fibers that project that connect 2 cerebral hemispheres. An example of this is the anterior column. These are mostly going to arise from layers 3 and layers 5 of the cortex. Lastly, we have projection fibers. Projection fibers are cortical fibers that synapse to non-cortical neurons, meaning they're not communicating with another region of the cortex. They're then going to communicate with the thalamus, the spinal cord, basal ganglia, and other structures. But again, not communicating with another region of the cortex directly. These are mostly going to originate from layers 5. That is the pyramidal layer, and layer 6, which is your fusiform layer. So pay attention to the color coding that is done on these slides, because in future slides, if you see anything in pink, that is going to represent that it is an association fiber, which is going to tell you that it is communicating between one region of the cortex versus another region of the cortex. If you see something in purple, that is going to be a commissural fiber, meaning that it is communicating between the 2 cerebral hemispheres. Lastly, if you see something in blue, that is going to tell you that it is a projection fiber, meaning that it is communicating from the cortex to some non-cortical region. All right, and with that, let's go into the actual fiber identification. Okay, so as you can see here, everything is in pink. That is going to tell us that these are all going to be association tracts. The first thing that I want to point out is arcuate fibers. Arcuate fibers are your short association fibers, or short association tracts. These are going to be little arcs that communicate with the same region or the same lobe of the cerebrum. Okay, so these little short arcs are your arcuate fibers. The next long association tract I want to point out is the superior longitudinal fasciculus. The superior longitudinal fasciculus is coming right here. So there goes your superior longitudinal fasciculus. Next, I want to point out the inferior occipitofrontal fasciculus, which is coming inferiorly, right? Great name, inferior occipitofrontal, coming inferiorly and running back. These fibers are eventually going to then go and intermingle with your optic radiations, right? And lastly, the uncinate fasciculus makes this hook shape right here. I think of it as a U. So U for uncinate, a U shape right here. That's just how I remember it. So uncinate fasciculus located at the inferior pole near the anterior region of the cerebrum. Okay, now again, this is a deeper dissection. You are now looking at the putamen and the fibers that are overlying the putamen. So what fibers overlie the putamen? If you think back, this is going to be our external capsule. Our external capsule is a projection tract because it is taking information from the cortex and then sending it somewhere else. So that is going to be a projection tract. We can still see arcuate fibers here. So arcuate fibers, again, those are those short association tracts, which is why it's in pink. Short association tracts. And then here we can see our inferior occipitofrontal fasciculus. Here goes our inferior occipitofrontal fasciculus. And if we followed it back, it would blend in with our optic radiations, also known as our geniculocalcarine tract. And to review the geniculocalcarine tract, go back to the lab 6 review or lab 7 review that goes through the special sensations. And one of those is vision. Okay, now from a cross section, I want to point out the cingulum. The cingulum is part of your limbic system, and it is going to be underneath the cingulate gyrus. So there goes your cingulate gyrus. Underneath that, you see this white matter region. That is the cingulum. And again, it is white matter, which makes sense because it is an association tract. It's a long association tract. That is your cingulum. It's part of the limbic system. You'll learn more about this in later labs, but it is important to recognize the cingulum underneath the cingulate gyrus at this portion of the course. I also want to point out in this particular cross section, we can see the optic tract. That is going to be this white matter region right here. So that is your optic tract. And then we have our basal ganglia, which we reviewed in a previous video. And then we have commissures. The commissures are important to recognize. The commissure is best seen on this particular slide. This is your anterior commissure. And remember that commissures, we'll see multiple on a slide in just a moment. But the commissures are communicating between the two different regions of the cerebral hemispheres. Lastly, we have our internal capsule. Our internal capsule here, this is going to be our posterior limb of the internal capsule. I know it's the posterior limb because I see the thalamus. And that is going to be a projection tract. We can say the same about all of these, the external capsule and the extreme capsule as well. Okay, now let's talk specifically about commissures. So we have an anterior commissure, posterior commissure, hippocampal commissure, and the corpus callosum. These are going to be the major commissures that we're going to need to know. The anterior commissure is located at the anterior region of the brain. Well, in order to figure out what's anterior, let's go through and figure out what we're seeing here. So the first thing that I'm looking for is this region right here is going to be the anterior portion of the third ventricle. I see the midbrain. I see a little bit of the pons. I see the cerebral aqueduct and the tectum back here in the back. So that gives me a general overview to say this is likely anterior. This is going to be posterior in the back. Okay, so anterior, posterior. I say, oh, the tectum's here. Right above that is the pineal gland. That makes sense. That must be posterior. This must be my superior cistern. Okay, this is a fiber dissection that has been done to show part of the limbic system, which you'll see later in the class. But it is important to still be able to orient yourself despite this fiber dissection being done. So I'm going to say up here at the front of the third ventricle, okay, I found my way back. There is my mammillary body. Well, if you remember, up here in the front, this has to be the anterior commissure. So anterior commissure is that little circle right there. Okay, anterior commissure. We go to the back, right above the tectum and below the pineal gland, right here. This is going to be your posterior commissure. Okay, and then right above your posterior commissure, difficult to see in this particular image. It's a little bit more theoretical, but right here would be your hippocampal commissure. Okay, and that's something that you'll really dive into in a later lab. But remember, if you see a commissure and it's pointing above the pineal gland, it's going to be the hippocampal commissure. Lastly, the corpus callosum, difficult to see here, but the corpus callosum is making the superior region of the spoto. Remember, we have the rostrum, the genu, which isn't really seen here, the body, and then back here we have the splenium. So there goes our splenium of the corpus callosum. Okay, and this is going to be our last slide, identifying different structures. I want to point out two specific commissures you can see on these cross sections that are likely to be tested. The first is your anterior commissure. Here goes your anterior commissure right here. Reasons I know this is the anterior commissure is I do not see the thalamus, but I see the lateral ventricles. So that tells me I'm in the anterior region of the brain. In addition, something that you don't necessarily need to be able to identify, but I can see the columns of the fornix. And the columns of the fornix are going to communicate closely with the anterior commissure. Then on this image over here, we are going to see the posterior commissure. Posterior commissure is located right here. The reason I know that is this is the superior cistern with the pineal gland, and we know just below the pineal gland, along the back of the cerebral aqueduct, is where we saw our posterior commissure. You can refer to one of the previous slides if you want to see that from a different view. Okay, I want to give just a couple of quick images that will help you to review, but I'm not going to go into any detail. So these are just here for you to review on your own. And that'll bring us to an end of this video.